A quiet suburban night is shattered by the desperate cries of a homeowner. No, they can't do this. Not again. A shadowy figure lurks nearby, their fingers hovering over a control panel as the water line to the neighborhood's homes slowly shuts off. Panic sets in as the community wakes to find their taps running dry. But one person knows the truth: this was no accident. A past grudge has set the stage for a shocking act of revenge. The tables are about to turn, and the hunter is about to become the hunted. The instant the water stopped flowing, Linda knew exactly who was behind it. Her fingers curled into fists as she stormed out of her townhouse, eyes blazing. "Those conniving idiots on the HOA board," she shouted, marching down the sidewalk. Ever since she'd refused to pay the latest round of exorbitant special assessment fees, the HOA had been making her life a living hell. They'd threatened fines, lay-ins, even foreclosure. But cutting off her water, that was a whole new level of retaliation. Linda reached the community's central utility box and punched in the access code, a code she'd secretly obtained years ago when she'd served on the HOA board herself. The metal door swung open, revealing a tangle of pipes, valves, and electronic controls. "Let's see how you like being on the other side of this," Linda muttered, her fingers flying over the dials. Within seconds, the flow of water to the neighboring homes began to slow, then stop completely. She allowed herself a grim smile of satisfaction. "That'll teach them to mess with me." The sudden silence was eerie. Linda could almost feel the panic setting in across the community as people woke to find their taps bone dry. She knew it was only a matter of time before the HOA board members came calling, demanding answers. Sure enough, 5 minutes later, the shrill ring of her cell phone pierced the air. Linda glanced down at the caller ID and rolled her eyes. Speak of the devils. She answered the call, doing her best to sound innocent and confused. "Hello." "Linda, what the hell is going on?" It was Margaret, the HOA president. Her voice was shrill with barely contained fury. "The entire neighborhood has no water. What did you do?" "Me? I didn't do anything," Linda lied smoothly. "I woke up just like everyone else to find my taps running dry. I thought maybe there was a problem with the main line or something." Margaret's voice dripped with suspicion. "That's funny, because we just checked the utility box, and it looks like someone's been tampering with the controls. Any idea who that might be?" Linda feigned shock. "Tampering? Oh my goodness, that's terrible. Do you think it could be vandals or something?" She paused, then added in a worried tone, "Should I call the police?" There was a brief silence on the other end of the line. "No need for that," Margaret finally said, her voice tense. "We'll handle this internally. But I want you to know that if we find out you had anything to do with this, there will be serious consequences." Of course, Linda said quickly. "I hope you're able to get the water back on soon. This must be so inconvenient for everyone." As she ended the call, Linda couldn't help but chuckle. "Inconvenient? You have no idea." Linda spent the next hour casually sipping her coffee and watching the chaos unfold around her. Panicked neighbors hurried back and forth, banging on doors and making frantic phone calls. The sound of dogs barking and children crying filled the air. Sure enough, within an hour, a convoy of black SUVs pulled up to the community entrance. Linda recognized the HOA board members as they rushed through the gates, their faces twisted with anger. A few minutes later, she heard the sound of angry voices outside her door. Smirking, she opened it to find Margaret and 2 other board members standing on her doorstep. "Linda, we know you're behind this," Margaret spat. "The water was shut off from the main utility box, and you're the only one who has the access code." Linda feigned innocence. "I told you, I have no idea what happened. I woke up just like everyone else with no water." She shook her head in mock concern. "This must be so frustrating for all of you. Have you called the water company?" "Of course we have," Margaret snapped. They said there's nothing wrong on their end. This is sabotage, pure and simple. And you're the only one with the means to do it. Linda put on her best concerned expression. Well, that's very serious. If someone is tampering with the community's water supply, that's a criminal offense. Maybe we should call the police. The other board members exchanged uneasy glances. We don't want to involve the authorities just yet, one of them said cautiously. We'd like to try to resolve this internally first. I understand, Linda said smoothly. But if I were you, I'd be very careful. Whoever did this is clearly someone with a grudge, and they're not afraid to cross some serious lines. I'd hate for anyone to get hurt. Margaret's eyes narrowed. Are you threatening us, Linda? Linda raised her hands in a placating gesture. Not at all. I'm just concerned for the safety of our community, that's all. She paused, then added with a sigh, Look, I know we've had our differences, but I would never do something like this. I'm just as much a victim as the rest of you. The board members exchanged another uneasy look. Finally, Margaret said, Well, if you happen to remember anything that could help us figure out who's behind this, you be sure to let us know. She turned and stalked away, the other board members trailing behind her. As soon as they were out of sight, Linda closed the door and allowed herself a triumphant grin. Oh, I'll be sure to let you know. All right. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity in the community. Desperate homeowners knocked on doors, begging to use their neighbors' bathrooms and fill up jugs of water. The sound of children crying and dogs barking echoed through the streets. Linda watched it all unfold from the comfort of her living room, her fingers drumming idly on the armrest of her chair. She knew the HOA board members were scrambling to get the water turned back on, but her tampering had been thorough. There was no way they'd be able to fix it without her help. As the afternoon wore on, she heard the roar of a truck engine outside and glanced out the window to see a large water tanker pulling into the community. The HOA had evidently called in reinforcements. Sure enough, several board members emerged from the truck, each carrying a heavy-duty hose. They quickly set to work, running the hoses from the tanker to the community's main water line. Within minutes, a trickle of water began to flow from the taps. Linda watched with amusement as her neighbors rushed to fill up buckets, jugs, and even their bathtubs. But her satisfaction quickly turned to annoyance as she saw the water pressure start to dwindle. Clearly, the HOA's temporary solution wasn't going to hold up for long. Just as she was about to head back to the utility box, her phone began to ring. Glancing down, she saw that it was Margaret. "What is it now?" she muttered, answering the call. "Linda, we need to talk," Margaret said, her voice strained. "The water tanker is only a temporary fix. We need to get the main line back up and running, but we can't figure out what's wrong." Linda feigned concern. "That's awful. Have you called the water company?" "Of course we have." Margaret snapped. "They're stumped too. We've tried everything, but the water just won't flow properly, and the pressure keeps dropping." She paused, then added in a reluctant tone, "Look, I hate to ask, but do you have any idea what might be causing this?" Linda hesitated, then let out a soft sigh. "Well, now that you mention it, I do remember seeing some suspicious activity around the utility box earlier today. I wasn't going to say anything, but..." She trailed off, leaving the implication hanging. "What?" Margaret demanded. "What did you see?" "I'd rather not get involved," Linda said, keeping her voice soft and apologetic. "I'm sure you and the board can figure it out. After all, you're the experts, right?" She paused, then added, "Although, if you do need any help, I suppose I could take a look. For the good of the community, of course." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Finally, Margaret spoke again, her voice tight with reluctance. "Okay, fine. Can you come down to the utility box?" "I'll be right there," Linda said, a triumphant smile spreading across her face. As Linda approached the utility box, she could see the HOA board members gathered around it, their faces etched with frustration. Margaret caught sight of her and waved her over. "Thank you for coming, Linda," she said, her tone clipped. "We're at our wits' end here. The water pressure just keeps dropping, no matter what we do." Linda peered over the board members' shoulders, her brow furrowed in feigned concern. Let me take a look." She leaned in, pretending to inspect the various valves and controls. After a few minutes, she straightened up and turned to face the group. "Well, I think I may have found the problem." She paused, meeting Margaret's gaze evenly. "It looks like someone has tampered with the main shutoff valve. It's almost completely closed." The board members exchanged horrified looks. "Tampered?" Margaret exclaimed. "You mean sabotage?" Linda nodded solemnly. "I'm afraid so. And from the looks of it, whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. This isn't something a casual vandal would be able to pull off." Margaret's face paled. "Oh my God, you don't think it's—" "I hate to say it, but I wouldn't be surprised," Linda interrupted, shaking her head slowly. "After all, I did warn you that the person behind this has a real grudge." One of the other board members, a man named John, stepped forward. "Can you help us fix it?" he asked, his voice tense. Linda pretended to consider for a moment. "Well, I suppose I could take a look, but this is a pretty delicate situation. If I'm not careful, I could end up making things worse." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "What are you saying, Linda?" "I'm just saying that this is a sensitive matter," Linda replied smoothly. "I'd hate for anything to happen to the community's water supply. Maybe it would be best if we called in a professional." The board members exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, Margaret sighed. "Okay, fine. What do you want?" Linda couldn't resist a subtle smirk. "I think we both know what I want. It's time to have a serious conversation about those special assessment fees." The HOA board members exchanged uneasy looks, clearly realizing they were cornered. Linda watched with a sense of grim satisfaction as Margaret's expression shifted from anger to resignation. "All right, Linda," she said through gritted teeth. "What do you want?" Linda pretended to consider for a moment. "Well, first and foremost, I want those special assessment fees waived. Permanently." Margaret's eyes widened. "Permanently? That's ridiculous. Those fees are essential for maintaining the community's infrastructure." Linda raised a hand, cutting her off. Let's not forget who's in control here. Unless you want to spend the next few days without running water, I'd suggest you reconsider." The other board members shifted uncomfortably, exchanging worried glances. Finally, John spoke up. "Okay, fine. The fees are waived. What else?" Linda allowed herself a small smile. "I want a seat back on the HOA board, with full voting rights." "What? Absolutely not," Margaret exclaimed. "You were voted off for a reason, Linda. We can't just let you waltz back in." "Oh, I think you can," Linda replied smoothly. "Unless, of course, you'd prefer to explain to the entire neighborhood why their water keeps cutting out." She paused, then added in a mock-sympathetic tone, "I can just imagine the headlines. HOA incompetence leaves community high and dry." The board members fell silent, their faces etched with a mix of anger and resignation. Finally, Margaret let out a heavy sigh. "Fine. You win. You're back on the board." Linda couldn't help but feel a surge of triumph. "Excellent. I'm so glad we could come to an agreement." She turned to the rest of the group, her expression suddenly serious. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to get to work on fixing that valve." Without another word, she stepped forward and began methodically adjusting the various controls. The board members watched in tense silence as the water pressure slowly began to build. After a few minutes, Linda stepped back with a satisfied nod. "There, that should do it. Your water should be back to normal in no time." Margaret eyed her warily. "And you're sure you've fixed a problem?" Linda met her gaze evenly. Absolutely. I wouldn't want anything to happen to the community's water supply. That would be a disaster, wouldn't it? The board members exchanged uneasy glances, but before they could say anything, the sound of rushing water filled the air. Linda couldn't help but smile as she watched the relief wash over their faces. Well, I'd say that's a job well done, she said, turning to leave. I'll be in touch about our next board meeting. As she walked away, Linda couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. She had finally gotten the upper hand on the HOA, and she had no intention of letting it go anytime soon. Over the next few days, a sense of uneasy calm settled over the community. The water had been restored, and aside from a few grumbling neighbors, life seemed to have returned to normal. But Linda knew better. She could feel the tension simmering beneath the surface, the unspoken resentment and mistrust that hung in the air. The HOA board members were watching her like hawks, their eyes narrowed with suspicion. Linda, for her part, maintained a cool and collected demeanor. She attended the next HOA meeting with her head held high, taking her seat at the table as if she had never left. The other board members eyed her warily, but they dared not challenge her presence. As the meeting progressed, Linda made it clear that she had no intention of being a passive member. She questioned every decision, challenged every proposal, and voiced her concerns with a level of intensity that left the others visibly uncomfortable. I'm simply looking out for the best interests of the community, she would say, her voice dripping with false sincerity. After all, we all want what's best, don't we? The other board members exchanged uneasy glances, but they knew better than to cross her. Linda had made it clear that she held the power, and they were powerless to stop her. As the meeting drew to a close, Margaret cleared her throat, her expression tense. Well, that covers the main agenda items. Is there anything else anyone would like to discuss? Linda raised her hand, a slight smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Actually, there is one more thing I'd like to bring up. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, bracing themselves for whatever was about to come. As you all know, the community's water system has been a bit temperamental. Lately, Linda began, her tone deceptively casual. I think it's clear that we need to invest in some serious upgrades to the infrastructure. Margaret's brow furrowed. Upgrades. But we just had that special assessment to cover maintenance costs. Linda nodded, her expression grave. I know. But clearly, that wasn't enough. And I, for one, am not willing to let our community's water supply be at the mercy of some disgruntled individual with a vendetta. The other board members murmured in agreement, their faces etched with concern. So, I propose that we allocate a significant portion of the community's reserve funds to a comprehensive overhaul of the water system. Linda continued, her voice firm. We need to ensure that this never happens again. Margaret opened her mouth to protest, but Linda raised a hand, cutting her off. And before you object, let me remind you that I have a rather unique insight into the workings of our water infrastructure. I think it's safe to say that my input would be invaluable in this endeavor. The board members exchanged uneasy glances, their faces pale. They all knew that crossing Linda at this point would be a dangerous game, one they couldn't afford to lose. Fine, Margaret finally said, her voice terse. We'll put it to a vote. Linda leaned back in her chair, a triumphant smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Excellent. I knew we could come to an agreement. In the weeks that followed, the community's water system underwent a dramatic transformation. Crews of workers swarmed the neighborhood, jackhammering the ground and laying new pipes. The sound of construction echoed through the streets, a constant reminder of the changes taking place. Linda watched the process with a sense of satisfaction, her fingers drumming idly on the armrest of her chair as she stared out the window. She knew that the other board members were seething with resentment, but they dared not challenge her. After all, she held the keys to the community's most vital resource. As the work neared completion, Linda called a special meeting of the HOA board. The other members filed in, their faces tense and wary. "Well, I must say, the new water system is looking quite impressive," Linda began, her tone dripping with mock enthusiasm. "It's amazing what a little investment can do, isn't it?" Margaret pursed her lips, her eyes narrowed. "Yes, well, the costs have been significant. I hope you're satisfied." Linda feigned a look of concern. "Significant? Oh my, that's not good news at all. I was hoping we'd be able to cover the expenses without dipping too deeply into the community's reserves." The other board members exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort palpable. "Well, we did have to reallocate a sizable portion of the reserve funds," John piped up, his voice hesitant. Linda clicked her tongue, shaking her head slowly. Sesk. I was afraid of that. You know, I really think we need to rethink our approach to community finances. After all, we can't be dipping into the reserves every time we have a little emergency, can we? Margaret's brow furrowed. "What are you getting at, Linda?" "What I'm getting at, my dear Margaret, is that we need to find a more sustainable way to fund our community's infrastructure," Linda replied, her voice smooth and even. "And I think I have the perfect solution." The other board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, clearly bracing themselves for what was to come. "I propose that we reinstate the special assessment fees," Linda continued, her eyes sweeping across the room. "But this time, we make them a permanent part of our budget. That way, we'll always have the necessary funds on hand to maintain our community's critical systems." The room erupted in a chorus of protests, with Margaret's voice rising above the rest. "Absolutely not. We can't just impose a permanent tax on the residents. They'll revolt." Linda raised a hand, silencing the group. Now, let's not be hasty. I think you'll find that the residents will be much more amenable to the idea if they know it's for the good of the community." She leaned back in her chair, a predatory smile spreading across her face. After all, they wouldn't want to risk another water crisis, would they? The board members fell silent, the implications of her words hanging heavy in the air. Linda knew she had them right where she wanted them. "So, what do you say?" she asked, her voice dripping with false innocence. "Shall we put it to a vote?" The HOA board meeting descended into chaos as Linda's proposal was met with a barrage of protests and objections. Margaret, the HOA president, slammed her fist on the table, her face flushed with anger. "Absolutely not, Linda. We can't just impose a permanent tax on the residents. They'll revolt." Linda remained calm, her expression almost serene. Now, Margaret, let's not be so hasty. I think you'll find that the residents will be much more amenable to the idea if they know it's for the good of the community." She leaned back in her chair, a subtle smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "After all, they wouldn't want to risk another water crisis, would they?" The implication hung in the air, thick with tension. The other board members exchanged uneasy glances, the fear of another water outage palpable. John, the treasurer, cleared his throat nervously. "But Linda, the cost of the recent upgrades has already drained a significant portion of our reserves. We can't just keep going back to the well, so to speak." Linda nodded, her expression grave. "I understand your concern, John. That's why I propose we make these special assessment fees a permanent part of our budget." She paused, letting the words sink in. "That way, we'll always have the necessary funds on hand to maintain our critical infrastructure." Margaret shook her head vehemently. "No, absolutely not. The residents will never go for it. They're already furious about the last round of fees." Linda fixed her with a steady gaze. "Then perhaps it's time we reminded them of the alternative." The room fell silent, the unspoken threat hanging in the air. Linda knew she had them cornered. The board members were well aware that she held the keys to the community's water supply, and she was not afraid to use that leverage. Finally, Margaret let out a resigned sigh. "Fine, we'll put it to a vote." Linda couldn't help but feel a surge of triumph. She had outmaneuvered the HOA at every turn, and now she was on the verge of cementing her control over the community. The residents may grumble, but they would have no choice but to comply. As the vote was cast and the motion passed, Linda allowed herself a satisfied smile. The community was now firmly under her thumb, and she had no intention of relinquishing that power anytime soon. In the days that followed, the permanent special assessment fees were implemented, much to the outrage of the residents. But with the specter of another water crisis looming, they had little choice but to comply. Linda watched it all unfold with a sense of grim satisfaction. She had won, and the HOA was now at her mercy. It was a victory that had come at a heavy price, but in the end, the ends had justified the means. As she looked out over the community, she couldn't help but feel a twinge of regret. This was not the way she had envisioned her life unfolding. But sometimes, when the stakes were high enough, you had to be willing to play a little dirty. And Linda was more than ready to get her hands dirty.